Life in the city. From the available evidence by archaeologists, a ruling elite had emerged in Ur. It includes a small section of people having a major share of wealth. The enormous riches of them is evident through the availability of jewelry, gold vessels, wooden musical instruments inlaid with white shell and lapis lazuli, ceremonial daggers of gold buried with some kings and queens. So there are several other features linked with the life in city. The first point is dealt with prevalence of nuclear family system. The available legal texts support that the nuclear family system was prevalent in Mesopotamia. This type of family comprises a man, his wife and children, but in some cases married sons and their families resided with their families. And the second point is based on prevalence of patriarchal system. The father was the head of the family in this kind of system. He was the key decision maker, and the wife would give humble obedience to his authority. This system rested on man's control of most or all property, starting with land. The third feature is based on procedures for marriage. Little did we know about the procedures for conducting the marriage by Mesopotamians. It seems that a marriage was arranged when the bride's parents gave their consent to the marriage. Even the gift was shared by the groom's people to the bride's people. At the time of marriage, gifts were exchanged by both parties, who ate together and made offerings in the temple. So when her mother-in-law would come to fetch her, the bride was given the share of the inheritance by her father, but the father's house, herds, fields, etc. were basically inherited by his sons. Next, we would move on to the city of Ur in Mesopotamia. So Ur is one of the earliest cities to have excavated in the 1930s. According to biblical tradition, the Ur city is named after the man who had founded the first settlement there. Here you would find several features of the city of Ur. The first feature is based on absence of town planning. The ordinary houses, of this town had narrow winding streets. Narrow winding streets means twisting or indirect streets. It indicates that wheeled carts, these are narrow winding streets. It indicates that wheeled carts could not have been reached many of these houses. Sacks of grains and firewood would have been arrived on donkey back. Narrow winding streets and the irregular shapes of house plots also indicate an absence of town planning, and there were absence of street drains of the kind that we observe in Mohenjo-daro. And the next feature is based on absence of drainage system. There were absence of street drains or sewerage system of the kind which existed in contemporary Mohenjo-daro. Instead, in the inner courtyards of the Ur houses, there were drains and clay pipes. It is thought that the house roofs sloped inwards, and rainwater was thus channeled through the drain pipes into the sumps in the inner courtyard. Owing to the rise of refuse on the street level, the thresholds of houses were raised so that no mud would flow inside after the occurrence of heavy rains. Maintenance of family privacy. In the Ur houses, the light came into their rooms not from the windows but from the doorways opening into the courtyards. So this would have given privacy to the families living over there. Record of superstitions about the houses in Oman tablets. So superstitions about houses as recorded in Oman tablets at Ur. Ur have recorded many superstitions about the houses in Oman tablets. For example, a raised threshold brought wealth. A front door that didn't usually open towards another house was considered as lucky. If the main door of a house opened outwards, the wife would be a torment to her husband. This is the Oman tablet stating the what? Stating the superstitions in terms of building the houses in Mesopotamia. And the last feature is based on establishment of town cemetery at Ur. Cemetery means graveyard where the dead bodies are buried. And there was also the presence of town cemetery. And the last feature is based on establishment of town cemetery at Ur. Cemetery means a graveyard where the dead bodies are buried. And there was also the presence of town cemetery at Ur. For example, the graves of royalty and commoners have been found over there. On the other hand, very few individuals were found buried under the floors of ordinary houses. And this is the kind of buried along with different objects. Status of women in Mesopotamian city. Women enjoyed, respectable position in the society. They also enjoyed equal status with man in the religious and social affairs of life, and they were free to set up their own trade and could keep slaves for either male or female. And they were also allowed to remarry, in case of the death of their husband. In case of the death of their husband, they could become the custodian of their husband property. For example, Devdasi system is said to have practiced by some Mesopotamians, a religious practice whereby parents marry a daughter to a deity or temple, and this marriage occurs before the girl reaches the stage of puberty. It was not actually considered a healthy social value in Mesopotamia. The palace at Mari of King Zimrilim. King Zimrilim built a palace in the capital city of Mari, and it was the residence of the royal family. And it was also a center of administration and also a place of production, particularly of precious metal ornaments. And this place had only one entrance on the north. And it was popular at that time, in such that a minor king, came from northern Syria just to see it, carrying with him a letter of introduction from a royal friend of the king Zimrilim. And there are daily available list reveal that huge quantities of food were presented each day for the king's table, such as flour, meat, bread, fish, fruit, beer, and wine. It seems that the king Zimrilim ate in the company of many others. And in and around the courtyard, this one is the court, in and around courtyards and the large open courtyards are paved white beautifully. Perhaps the king received foreign dignitaries and his own people at the audience hall with the wall paintings that have after the visitors. And the palace was a sprawling structure with 260 rooms and covered an area of 2.4 hectares. This is the palace of King Zimrilim, whereas this is the broken statue of the King Zimrilim. The entrance of the palace lies in the north. This one is the court. Next, a trading town in a pastoral zone. So Mari was a trading town in a pastoral zone. After 2000 BCE, the royal city of Mari flourished. And Mari was located not just on the southern plain with its highly productive agriculture, but much further on the upstream of Euphrates. Location of Mari, okay. Some communities in this region of Mari were both farmers and pastoralists. Agriculture and animal rearing were carried out in this region, and most of the region was used for pasturing sheep and goats. And herders also exchanged, animals, cheese, leather, and meat in return for metal tools with farmers. Herders exchanged animals, cheese, leather, and meat in return for metal tools with the farmers. And there were repeated, clashes between the animal herders and farmers of Mari. And some of them are, firstly, the shepherds of Mari used to take their herds through the standing crops on their way when going out in search of water. It caused immense damage to the crops of the farmer. Secondly, the shepherds used to invade the inhabitants of the villages and seize their stored goods. Thirdly, the farmers denied herders access to sources of river and canal water. It has thus led to clashes between them. And lastly, some groups of herders used to serve as agricultural laborers or helpers in assisting in harvest. With the passage of time, their income increased and they became prosperous. Then they began to live, a settled life which was not acceptable to farmers. Thus, it has led to the emergence of struggle or clashes between them. For example, the camps of herders are mentioned repeatedly in letters between king and officials. Herders of various types were allowed to move in the kingdom, but their movement or activity was strictly watched by the appointed officials. In a letter, an official wrote to the king that he was seeing frequent fire signals at night sent by one camp to another, and he suspected that a raid was being planned by herders against farmers. The nomadic groups of Western Desert entered into a prosperous agricultural land, and such groups would come as herders, harvest laborers, or hired soldiers and settled down. A few had gained their political power, and these included the Akkadians, Amorites, Assyrians, and Arameans. The kings of Mari were Amorites and raised a temple at Mari for Dagan, the god of steppe. Amorites were members of a semi-nomadic people living in Mesopotamia, Palestine, and Syria in the 3rd millennium BC, and they were founders of the ancient city of Mari on the Euphrates and the first dynasty of Babylon. And the Mesopotamian society and culture were undoubtedly open to, different people or cultures. Thus, the strength of the civilization was, of course, an intermixture culture. And Mari is a good example of an urban center specifically prospering on trade. These are Amorites. In terms of trade, Mari, having located on Euphrates in the central position of trade, wood, copper, wine, tin, oil, etc. were carried in boats along the Euphrates between the south and mineral-rich uplands of Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon. There were boats carrying grinding stones, wood, and wine and oil jars, having stopped at Mari on their way to southern cities. The officers of this town would often go abroad, inspect the cargo, and levy charges about 1/10 of the value of the goods. And the barley was also came in special grain boats. Tablets also refers to the coming of copper from Eleusia, the island of Cyprus, which was known for its copper, and tin was also an item of trade. Even the bronze trade was significant, as it was used as the main industrial material for making tools and weapons. Although the kingdom of Mari was not militarily strong, but it was extremely prosperous. Excavating Mesopotamian towns. Here you would study about Abu Salabik. Abu Salabik was the site of a small, Sumerian city-state, about 10 hectares in area in 2500 BC, with having a population of less than 10,000. And the outlines of the walls were first, discovered by removing surfaces. And this involves, removing of, the top few millimeters of the mound. Mound means a heap or a pile of material, with the sharp and white end of a shovel or other tools. Though the soil underneath was still slightly moist, archaeologists could find out different colors, textures and lines of brick walls or pits or other features. And the archaeologists, have sieved through tons of earth in order to find out plant or animal remains. And in this process, they found many species of plants and animals, and found, large quantities of charred fish bones that had been carried or swept out onto the streets, and plant seeds and fiber that remained after dung cake had been burned as fuel, and thus kitchens were identified by archaeologists. Living rooms were those with having fewer traces. Archaeologists found the teeth of very young pigs on the streets. They concluded that the pigs might have been roamed freely here as in some other Mesopotamian towns. And there was one house burial contained some pig bones. The dead person must have given some pork for his nourishment in the afterlife. The archaeologists also made microscopic studies of room floors to decide which room in a house were roofed with poplar, logs, leaves, straws, etc., and which were open to the sky. The ways of gathering archaeological data has changed dramatically due to the massive technological development. Hence the Mesopotamian excavators have higher standard of accuracy and care in terms of recording archaeological data than in the ancient days. Cities in Mesopotamian culture. So Mesopotamians had cherished the city life in which many communities and cultures had lived next to each other. After the cities were destroyed in war, they had recollected them in poetry, and the Epic of Gilgamesh reminds us the pride of the Mesopotamians who took in their cities. Gilgamesh, was the ruler of Uruk and a great hero who defeated people far and wide. And he faced, a shock when his heroic friend died. He then started to find out the secret of immortality. Immortality means eternal life. So after making a heroic attempt, Gilgamesh failed and returned to Uruk. There he consoled himself, walking along the city wall back and forth. He began to admire, the foundations made of burned bricks that he had built. It is on the city wall of Uruk that the long tale of heroism and struggle disappears. He finally realized, that the death is inevitable, and he doubted that even if he dies, his son will live longer than him or not. He finally consoled himself, in the city built by his people. So the first picture here shows Gilgamesh, the ruler of Uruk. And the second picture shows Uruk city, which was said to have built by Gilgamesh. And it was decorated with mosaics of painted clay cones embedded in the walls and extraordinary works of art. Large-scale sculpture in the round and relief carving appeared for the first time together with metal casting, using the lost wax process to express his political power. And the oldest recognized written fiction is the Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written on clay tablets in the 3rd millennium BC. According to this, once the god Anu had ordered the goddess Arur to create such a god who could surpass Gilgamesh. The goddess thus created Enkidu, who could fight with Gilgamesh. The goddess thus created Enkidu, who fought with Gilgamesh. The god Enkidu was heavily impressed, by his skill, and soon they became friends. Thereafter, Gilgamesh's friend Enkidu fell in love with a beautiful dancing girl, and this situation had enraged, the deities. so they decided to end the life of Enkidu. Soon thereafter, he fell ill and died. So some historians believe that Gilgamesh was a real king of the city of Uruk. According to the story, Gilgamesh was part god and part man. His mother was a goddess named Ninsun, and his father Lugalbanda was the half-god king of Uruk. And the oldest, recognized written fiction is the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, which was written on clay tablets in the 3rd millennium BC. And there is another instance. Utnapishtim is a character in ancient, Mesopotamian mythology, and he is tasked, by the god Ingi to create a giant ship to be called preserver of life in preparation for a giant flood that would wipe out all life. And he was the only survivor of a flood, since having preserved human and animal life in a great boat he built and received immortality from the god. And Gilgamesh once, consulted him about the secret of immortality. He revealed the secret of immortality by finding the plant lying at the bottom of the ocean. Gilgamesh accepted this challenge and jumped into the ocean to bring that said plant. On his return, he was tired and fell asleep. Meanwhile, a snake approached, to the scene and took away his plant. When he woke up, he observed that his plant was missing. Finally, he realized, the fact that man can never be mortal. So, Gilgamesh, seeks immortality not because of his grief for Enkidu, but because of his fear and grief for his own death, in the view of some historians. And next we would move on to the early Mesopotamian urban society. And the early Mesopotamian urban society consists of 3 social categories. The first class includes what? King, the priests, the rich, merchants, officials, and high officials. And the second class includes small scale merchants, artisans, state officials, and intellectuals, whereas the third class includes the lowest strata of the society, slaves. So here you would find the Mesopotamian society. Okay. The early Mesopotamian urban society was divided into 3 categories. The first class. The first class is also known as the upper class. The upper class included kings, nobles, priests, rich merchants who owned their own companies, scribes, private tutors, and in time high-ranking military men. Other occupations of the upper class were accountants, architects, astrologers, who were usually priests, and shipwrights. This group of people led a luxurious life and lived in magnificent buildings and palaces, and they wore expensive clothes and used to eat sumptuous food. They were served by several men and women slaves. Their dead bodies were buried along with the precious items such as gold, vessels, jewelry, oyster shell, and lapis lazuli. And the second class is also known as the lower class, and the lower class was made up of those occupations which kept the city or region actually functioning. Farmers, artists, musicians, construction workers, canal builders, bakers, basket makers, butchers, fishermen, brick makers, carpenters, perfume makers, potters, jewelry makers, goldsmith, cart, and later chariot drivers, soldiers, merchants who worked for another man's company. And the second class people also led luxurious life. And the third class is also known as the lowest class. The third lowest social class was the slaves. One could become a slave in a number of ways, such as being captured in war, selling oneself into slavery to pay off a debt, being sold as punishment for crime, or being kidnapped and sold into slavery in another region, or being sold by a family member to relieve a debt. And they led miserable life. The dead bodies of the common people were buried along with the ordinary objects such as pots, ornaments, jewelries. So it indicates of having great disparity between the sections of people. The legacy of writing. So legacy means something that is handed down from one period of time to another period of time, or something handed down from an ancestor to predecessors. We can transmit moving narratives or ideas by orally, but the science requires written texts that generations of scholars can read and make further researches. So perhaps the greatest legacy of Mesopotamia to the world is its contribution to the tradition of time reckoning and mathematics. Scholarly tradition of time reckoning and mathematics. The division of the year into 12 months according to the revolution of moon around the earth, the division of moon into 4 weeks, the division of day into 24 hours, the division of the hour into 60 minutes has transmitted to us from the Mesopotamians. These time divisions were said to have adopted by successors of Alexander, and from them had been passed on to the Roman Empire, then to the Islamic Arab Empire, and to the medieval Europe. So the archaeologists have found tablets with multiplication and division tablets and division tables, squares and square root tables and tables of compound interest written during 1800 BCE. So in terms of astronomy, it is the study of the sun, moon, stars, planets, comets, gas, galaxies, dust and other non-earthly bodies and phenomena. So Mesopotamian astronomers, having used their advanced math, they were able to follow the movement of the stars, planets and moon. Whenever the solar or lunar eclipse were observed, their occurrences were recorded according to the year, month and day. The observed position of stars, constellations. Constellation is a group of stars that make an imaginary shape in the night sky. So the constellations in the night sky were also recorded. One major achievement was the ability to predict the movement of several planets, and they thus took logic, mathematics and a scientific approach. And the significant Mesopotamian achievements would not have been possible without the contribution of writing and the establishment of school where students read and copied the past written tablets of predecessors. Thus, there are two early attempts made by the Mesopotamians to locate and preserve the texts and tradition of the past. Ashurbanipal. So Ashurbanipal was the well-known ruler of Nineveh, and he ruled from 668 to 627 BCE. He had set up, many beautiful temples and buildings, and he also got repaired old buildings and temples and several gardens, built by him, which had added, beauty to his capital. And he patronized literature and constructed a massive, library at his capital city, Nineveh, which lies in the north, and it is the world's, oldest known library, which was founded sometime in the 7th century BC for the royal contemplation. And he contributed great, efforts to gather tablets on various subjects such as history, epics, omen, literature, astrology, hymns and poems, etc. And he sent his scribes in the south in order to find old tablets, as the scribes in the south were trained to read and write in schools. The scribes, stated Assurbanipal's name and the date on which the tablets were written. And some tablets, ended its writing with a reference to Assurbanipal, such as I, Assurbanipal, king of the universe, king of Assyria, on which the gods presented vast intelligence, who could gain the concealed details of scholarly learning. I wrote down on tablets the wisdom of gods by checking and examining the tablets. I placed them for the future in the library of the temple of my god, Nabu, at Nineveh, for my life and the well-being of my soul, and to sustain the foundations of my royal throne. So all the literary works available in the library were arranged in subject wise, but its actual prestige began to lose after his death. Assyrian king Assurbanipal's great library with thousands of cuneiform tablets library, which was set up at the capital city of Nineveh. And these are what? Cuneiform tablets stored in the library. So Nabonidus, he was, the last king of independent Babylon, who reigned in the mid-6th century BCE, is generally, considered the first archaeologist. He released, Babylonia from Assyrian domination in 625 BC. So historians mention that Nabonidus excavated the ancient temples in order to discover the past foundations. He wrote that the god of Ur appeared in his dream and ordered him to appoint a priestess to take charge, of the cult in the ancient town in the deep south. He wrote that owing to the forgotten system of appointing the high priestess for a very long time, her characteristic features nowhere stated, he bethought himself day after day. Then he mentioned that he found a stele of a very early king and saw on that stele the carved image of the priestess. He observed, the clothing style and jewelry that was portrayed. Thus, similarly, he was able to, dress his own daughter for her consecration as priestess. So, at a different occasion, Nabonidus' man brought to him a broken statue written with the name of Sargon, king of Agad. So, Nabonidus thought he should repair this statue at any cost, owing to his reverence for the gods and respect for kingship. He wrote that he had further ordered his skilled craftsman and replaced the head of Sargon's statue. The first stele depicts Sargon, the king of Agad, and the second stele depicts the priestess of Mesopotamia. So thus the above mentioned points are based on the legacies of Mesopotamia to the world. With this, we have come to the end of the second chapter called Writing and City Life.